The crowd roared as the iron chains rattled. But William Wallace, once the towering, defiant face of Scottish rebellion, could barely keep his eyes open. His body, stripped and broken, had already been dragged for miles through the filth-clogged streets of London, tied behind a horse. Now, tied down and exposed before a sea of jeering English spectators, his real punishment was about to begin, and it would be unlike anything most of them had ever seen. First, the executioners hanged him, but not to death. They let him choke, thrash and flail, pulling him down just before his neck could snap. The moment he gasped for air, they castrated him, alive, without pause. The crowd gasped, some laughed, some turned away, but it didn't stop there. Next, they slit open his stomach, reached in, and pulled out his intestines, laying them before him as his heart pounded through the pain. His entrails, steaming in the open air, were then burned in front of his eyes. He was fully conscious. His screams are not recorded, but they echoed through the alleys for years. And then, finally, his heart was torn from his chest. Still alive or not, no one can say for certain. But the English king wanted this to be more than just death. He wanted a message, and it worked. This wasn't just an execution. It was one of the most savage punishments ever carried out on a man in public view. But what led to this horrific moment? Who was William Wallace really? And why did King Edward I go to such gruesome lengths to erase him from history? The truth behind Wallace's execution is far more disturbing than anything you've seen in films or folklore. And once you hear it, you'll never forget it. For most people, the name William Wallace conjures a single image: a wild-eyed warrior, face streaked in blue paint, sword raised high, shouting freedom across a misty battlefield. Thanks to Hollywood, Braveheart in particular, Wallace has become a near-mythical figure, a man of pure defiance, a peasant-turned-hero who rose against tyranny with nothing but courage, love, and a broadsword. In that story, he's a symbol of resistance, a martyr, a legend sculpted in romance and rage. But legends are clean, history is not. Because the real William Wallace wasn't just a noble rebel who fought for freedom. He was also a brutal warfighter, a man forged in blood and grief, a tactician who understood terror as a weapon, and the path that led him to one of the most horrifying deaths in recorded history was soaked in far more complexity, betrayal, and violence than any movie dares to show. Wallace didn't charge into battle for glory. He rose because his country was bleeding, because his king had vanished, because the English had tightened their grip on Scotland like a fist around a dying flame. And when Wallace pushed back, he didn't fight clean. He fought to crush. He led raids. He burned villages. He slaughtered garrisons. To the English crown, he wasn't a hero. He was a nightmare. And in the end, that nightmare had to be ended, publicly, painfully, and permanently. So forget what you think you know, because the man behind the myth suffered a fate so monstrous, so methodical in its cruelty, that even his enemies would speak of it in hushed tones. His execution wasn't simply about death. It was about breaking him, piece by piece, for all the world to see. And now, we peel away the legend to reveal the chilling, flesh and bone reality of William Wallace. Before he became a symbol, before the statues and the speeches, before the face paint and war cries, William Wallace was simply a man. Born around 1270, likely in Elderslie, in Renfrewshire, Wallace was not a poor farmer or a commoner, as Hollywood suggests. He came from the lower ranks of the Scottish nobility, gentry, not royalty. He was educated, trained in warfare, and well versed in both Latin and law. In another life, he might have served as a quiet landowner or minor knight. But history had other plans, because Wallace's Scotland was on the edge of collapse. In 1286, King Alexander III died unexpectedly, his horse plunging off a cliff. His heir, a young girl known as the Maid of Norway, died just 4 years later, and with her, the royal bloodline vanished. What followed was chaos. 13 claimants scrambled for the Scottish throne. The nobles were divided, civil war loomed, and into that vacuum stepped a king from the south, Edward I of England, known to history as Longshanks, ruthless, cold, calculating. He offered to mediate the Scottish succession, but instead seized control, reducing Scotland to a vassal state. He installed English officials, built English castles, demanded Scottish loyalty, and when resistance flared, he crushed it. To the English, Scotland was a territory to be managed. To the Scots, it was a land under siege, and in the middle of it all stood William Wallace. No crown, no claim to the throne, no grand army. Just a man with steel in his hand and fire in his chest. In 1297, Wallace led a violent uprising, attacking English strongholds and killing their garrisons. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for noble approval. He struck like lightning, and the people followed. Then came the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Outnumbered, out-equipped, Wallace and his men used the land itself as a weapon. As English knights attempted to cross a narrow bridge, Wallace attacked with brutal precision. The result was a slaughter, an English army decimated, and Wallace crowned a national hero. For the first time, Scotland had hope. And that's what made him dangerous. Not just his sword, not just his cunning, but the fact that he inspired belief. To Edward I, Wallace wasn't simply a rebel. He was a disease, a defiance that could spread. And like any threat to a king's rule, he had to be silenced. Not just defeated, not just executed. He had to be destroyed, in body and in memory. But as you'll see, the crown failed on both counts. For years, William Wallace had eluded capture. Even as English forces swept through Scotland, razing towns and rooting out rebels, Wallace vanished into forests and mountains like a ghost. He had no kingdom to protect, no castle to defend, just a name that inspired rebellion and a will that refused to die. But in the end, it wasn't English steel that brought him down. It was Scottish treachery. In the summer of 1305, after nearly 8 years of rebellion, Wallace was finally caught near Glasgow. He wasn't on a battlefield. He wasn't surrounded by soldiers. He was likely resting, perhaps hiding, perhaps trying to rebuild what was left of the resistance. The man who handed him over? Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish noble. A man who once shared his homeland, his faith, maybe even his vision. But when the weight of English pressure became too heavy, Menteith bent the knee. And when Edward's men needed someone to find and seize the most wanted man in Britain, Menteith led them straight to him. There was no epic fight, no final stand. Wallace was arrested quietly, dragged away like a criminal. The betrayal was surgical, clean, quiet, and devastating. Some say Menteith was bribed. Others say he acted under orders, hoping to protect what remained of Scotland's nobility from further wrath. Still others believe he saw Wallace not as a hero, but as a threat to order. A man who had outlived his usefulness. A symbol more dangerous than helpful in a time when peace felt more valuable than pride. Whatever his reasons, he didn't just betray a man, he betrayed a movement. Because Wallace's capture didn't just end a rebellion. It sent a message. Even the fiercest warrior in Scotland could be bought, bound, and broken. Imagine the weight of that moment. A man who had faced down the English crown, who had outwitted armies, who had watched comrades fall in his name, betrayed by someone who spoke the same language, shared the same hills, walked the same ruined path. There was no dignity in his fall, no honour, no mercy, just shackles, chains, and the long road to London. But Edward, I wasn't satisfied with a mere arrest. Wallace's death would not be swift. It would be a lesson carved in flesh, and what followed would be remembered for centuries as one of the most grotesque executions in history. When William Wallace arrived in London, the city buzzed with anticipation. To the English public, he was no longer a man. He was a monster, a legend draped in blood and myth. Rumours of his brutality had travelled south for years. The Scot who had torched English towns, who had killed their soldiers, who had defied their king and lived to tell the tale. Now, he was shackled and filthy, paraded through the streets like a trophy. But this would not be a fair reckoning. It was never meant to be. Wallace was taken to Westminster Hall, England's seat of justice. But justice had no place there that day. No defence counsel, no jury, no chance. The charges read like a list of sins scrawled in fury. High treason against King Edward I. Murder of English civilians and soldiers. Inciting rebellion across the Scottish countryside. Sacrilege and savagery, as one chronicler put it, beyond what a beast would do. But here lies the great irony, the silent scream behind the pageantry of punishment. Wallace was never Edward's subject. He had never sworn allegiance to the English crown. By the laws of war and honour, Wallace should have been treated as an enemy combatant, a knight of a sovereign people. But Edward would hear none of that. To recognise Wallace as a soldier was to recognise Scotland's right to resist. And so he was branded a traitor, not a warrior, not a prisoner of war, but a criminal against a king he had never served. Wallace, chained in front of the court, refused to beg. He refused to confess. He refused even to acknowledge Edward's claim over him. According to the Flores Historiarum, a 13th century chronicle, Wallace responded to the charge of treason with chilling defiance. I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. There it was, simple, undeniable, and utterly irrelevant. The sentence had already been written, his fate already carved. This trial was no search for truth. It was a performance, staged for the powerful and etched into the bones of law with vengeance. Even his execution had been preordained, not just to kill him, but to unmake him. The court ordered the most severe punishment imaginable. He would be hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body destroyed in stages, his death made a public ritual of humiliation. Because this was not justice, it was spectacle, and it was only just beginning. On August 23rd, 1305, William Wallace was led from the Tower of London to his death, but not to a scaffold, not to a blade, or a noose, or a clean ending. This was not an execution. It was a ritual of obliteration, one designed not just to kill his body, but to burn fear into the bones of every man, woman, and child who dared dream of rebellion. They began with the dragging. Wallace was stripped naked, tied to a wooden hurdle, and fastened behind a horse. Then, through the streets of London, miles of dirt, stone, and screaming crowds, he was dragged face down, his skin scraped raw, bones jarring against cobblestone, sewage and blood smeared into open wounds. He arrived at Smithfield, a public square thick with onlookers, merchants, nobles, mothers holding their children aloft to see. No one wanted to miss what came next. They began by hanging him, a rope around his neck, lifted just enough to strangle, but not to kill. They let him twitch, let him gasp, let him turn purple and claw at the air, dangling between life and death. And when the darkness began to creep into his eyes, they cut him down, still breathing, still aware. Then came the castration. No ceremony, no hesitation. His genitals were sliced off while he lay there helpless, his hands bound, his mouth unable to scream loud enough to rise above the roar of the crowd. Next, they opened him up. A knife plunged into his abdomen, his belly peeled open, and from inside, his intestines were pulled out, slowly, deliberately, foot after foot of steaming entrails, unfurling like rope from a sailor's coil. They laid his organs before him. Then, they burned them, right there, inches from his face, as if to show him, this is what's inside you. This is what we think of your courage. Whether Wallace was conscious at this point, we may never know, but some accounts suggest he was, that his eyes were open, that he could see, smell, and feel every final insult before death finally approached. Then, they tore out his heart. Some say he was still breathing when it happened. Only after this unholy display did they allow his body the release of decapitation. His head was chopped off and dipped in tar to preserve it, then mounted on London Bridge as a warning to all. But the message didn't end there. His body was quartered, cut into 4 equal parts, each limb hacked from the trunk and packed for transport. 1 quarter sent to Newcastle, another to Berwick, 1 to Stirling, 1 to Perth. Not randomly chosen. These were the corners of Scotland where Wallace's name had once inspired rebellion. Now they would see his bones. Because this wasn't justice. This was theatre, political terror in its purest form, a warning written in flesh. If you rise against the crown, this is how you fall. And for centuries, the story worked. His death became a tale parents told in hushed voices. His mutilation, a dark reminder that kings do not forgive traitors, and that empire does not tolerate defiance. But empires forget one thing. Blood can be buried. Bones can be scattered. But legends rise again. The English crown had no illusions about what it was doing. This wasn't simply the execution of a man. It was the erasure of a threat, a calculated demonstration meant to paralyze a nation with fear. King Edward I, known as Longshanks, was not merely punishing rebellion. He was staging a warning. Wallace had become more than flesh and blood. He was a symbol of resistance, of pride, of a Scotland that would not kneel. And symbols, Edward knew, had to be broken publicly, torn apart, not just in body, but in meaning. Every step of Wallace's execution was designed to communicate dominance, dragging him naked through the city, humiliation, torturing him in stages, power over life and pain, quartering his body and scattering it across the realm, control over geography, over memory, over myth. This was the medieval state at its most theatrical, violence as propaganda. To the English ruling class, the message was simple. This is what happens when you defy the crown. Not just to Wallace, to anyone. Nobles, clergy, commoners, anyone who so much as whispered dissent. But power rarely controls how history remembers cruelty, because the public reaction was not as clean as the king had hoped. Yes, the crowds came. Yes, many cheered. Yes, some English citizens viewed Wallace as a butcher who got what he deserved. To them, he was a savage who had razed villages and slaughtered English garrisons without mercy. His death felt like revenge. Gruesome, yes, but righteous. Yet beneath the spectacle, there were murmurs of unease. Even some English chroniclers recorded the execution with a tone of grim discomfort. The sheer scale of brutality made some question whether justice had crossed into madness. And among the Scots, even those who had turned against him, his death became a wound, deep, bleeding, unforgivable. Many in Scotland, including former critics, began to view Wallace not just as a warrior, but as a martyr. His suffering turned him from man to myth, from rebel to symbol of national pride. The English crown had tried to shatter his legacy, but in doing so, they had made it impossible to forget him. According to the Chronicle of Lanercost, even English churchmen questioned the severity of the sentence, calling it a punishment most cruel and excessive in the eyes of God. But for Edward, that was irrelevant. He had sent his message, and if it was soaked in blood and bile, all the better. But there's a quiet irony here. The king who ordered Wallace's execution with such finality would not live forever, and the rebellion he tried to snuff out, it would burn again, because while bodies can be quartered, ideas cannot. They thought they had destroyed him, that by hanging, dismembering, and scattering his remains, they could extinguish the memory of William Wallace forever. But the Crown made one critical miscalculation. You can kill a man. You cannot kill what he represents. In the years following Wallace's execution, his legend didn't fade. It grew, in whispers, in ballads, in taverns and castles and peasant firesides. His agony, once meant to terrify, became a badge of honor, a story that passed from mouth to mouth, no longer about his body, but about his courage. He became not just a martyr, but a mythical prototype of freedom. And though the rebellion he led had collapsed by the time of his death, it would rise again. Just 9 years later, in 1314, another Scot, Robert the Bruce, would lead a decisive victory at the Battle of Bannockburn, securing Scotland's independence for a generation. It's impossible to say how much Wallace's memory fueled that final charge, but his death had already lit a fuse, one that smouldered in every Scot who still believed in a land unruled by foreign hands. But with myth comes distortion. In Braveheart, Wallace is a romantic outlaw, a lover, a peasant, a blue-painted warrior who bedded a French princess and screamed freedom with his last breath. That version is powerful, but it's also fiction. The truth is far messier, and in many ways more meaningful. Wallace was likely a knight, not a farmer. He never met Princess Isabella. She would have been a child at the time of his death. There's no record of a wife named Murren. And while he may not have screamed freedom at his execution, he lived it, with every act of defiance, every battle, and every breath taken outside English rule. His real life was not a poem. It was a struggle, a slow grind against a merciless empire, in a time when justice was decided by swords, not courts. And so we ask, was it worth it? He lost. He died in agony. His body was destroyed, his name defiled in English courts, his cause, at the time, seemingly crushed. But Wallace's death did what his life could not. It became a rallying cry, a fire in the dark, a moment so brutal, so unforgettable, that it forced the world to remember what one man could endure for the dream of freedom. And that dream still breathes in Scottish identity today. Not because of what he won, but because of what he refused to surrender. Not his sword, not his dignity, not his soul. So now you know. William Wallace's execution wasn't just cruel. It was far more disturbing than you imagined. It was a slow, methodical destruction of a man meant to terrify generations. A carefully staged ritual of pain where every cut, every flame, every torn piece of flesh was a message, written by a king who feared what Wallace symbolized more than he feared any sword. Because this wasn't about punishing a crime, it was about preserving power. It was about showing the world what happens when a common man dares to defy a crown. It was about using death not to end life, but to control the living. But history has a habit of misfiring on those who try to write it in blood. Wallace became the very thing Edward I feared, a legend. Not because he lived, but because of how he died. Not because he won, but because he refused to kneel. His broken body became a mirror for every people who've ever stood up against empires, against oppression, against silence. And centuries later, the question still echoes. Was William Wallace a martyr or a warning? A hero carved into myth, or a reminder of how far those in power will go to keep it? That answer is yours to decide. But one thing is certain. Once you've seen what was done to William Wallace, you'll never forget his name again.